Good evening and welcome. I'm Inara Scott. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for the College of Business, and I'm happy to welcome you, delighted actually, to welcome you to the annual Susan J. McGregor Memorial Lecture in Women's Leadership. We are joined tonight by our extremely attractive and well-dressed first-year student body of the OSU College of Business, as well as faculty, staff, community members, and others joining us online. So welcome to all of you. We are so happy you're here. For almost 10 years now, we've been bringing a guest speaker to campus to talk to our business undergraduates about women's leadership. We've hosted CEOs, faculty researchers, startup founders, and more. And while each year's speaker has a unique take on the topic, one commonality emerges year after year: that women and people of all genders bring valuable, unique insights and contributions to our classrooms, our workplaces, our C-suites, and our communities. When women are empowered to lead, when structures and systems enable women's success, we all benefit. We've known for a long time that businesses thrive under women's leadership, and we've seen some significant gains in recent years. McKinsey reports that C-suite representation has increased from 17% to 28% since 2015. The pandemic helped to normalize workplace flexibility, hybrid and remote work, which has benefited women with caregiving responsibilities and helped people of all genders improve their work-life balance. And yet, we have a long way to go to achieve gender equality at work. Women still only earn 84 cents on every dollar earned by a man. Women still experience workplace bias, slights, and microaggressions that impact wellness and workplace inclusion. Women of color, queer, lesbian, and trans women, women with disabilities, and women who hold other marginalized identities experience even greater disparities, as well as bias and harassment at work. We have so much to be proud of, but we also have much work to do. And that's why we are committed to bringing this message to all the students who attend the College of Business. Because no matter your gender, gender equality matters. Gender inclusion matters. And women's leadership in business matters. Tonight's speaker, Melanie Ho, brings a fresh perspective to this conversation. She shows us how complex and systemic the barriers to women's leadership really are. And most importantly, she shows us that individual solutions alone aren't going to fix a problem that is so systemic and widespread. We are excited to hear her message tonight. As a heads up, we will have a few minutes before we conclude tonight for a question and answer session with our speaker, so you will have a chance to ask for more detail or clarification as we wrap up. And before we hear more from our speaker, please welcome to the stage the Sarah Hart Kimball Dean of the College of Business, Dr. Tim Carroll.
All right, you gave me a very nice welcome. I hope we'll have an even better one for our speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you, Inara. So welcome, everybody. Good to have you with us tonight. This lecture series has been established through the estate of Susan J. McGregor, in keeping with her interest in supporting women's leadership and her alma mater. Susan graduated from the College of Business in 1985 and tragically passed away in 2014 after a valiant battle with brain cancer. Her career included stints at the IRS and Coopers & Lybrand before she joined Microsoft, where she rose through the ranks of the tax department to become one of the company's first general managers in 2007. Susan was an Alpha Phi and an avid Beaver believer. In keeping with her interest in supporting women's leadership and her alma mater, her family established an endowed lecture fund, as well as an endowed scholarship and professional development funds in the name of Susan and her mother, Jean. A sincere thank you to her family for making this evening's lecture possible. Our College of Business faculty and staff are proud to be able to bring our students and community together to address gender inequality in the workplace. This is our 8th year hosting the McGregor Lecture. It's a testament to our dedication to making advances in gender equality. It's also a testament to the fact that we need to. Hosting and attending lectures like this one is a small but important step. Our goal tonight, and with every McGregor Lecture, is to bring the issues of inequality that Inara spoke about to light and to create ways to make progress. Students here are the future of the workplace. We want to make sure we give you the tools to make lasting changes in that space. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Melanie Ho. She is the Oh, you missed your cue. Well done, though. Hold on, hold tight. She is the, you threw me off a little bit. Well done, though. I love the enthusiasm. She is the founder of Strategic Imagination, a firm dedicated to drawing on the power of the arts to inspire social and organizational change. She is an award-winning author, speaker, and workshop facilitator. For the past 2 decades, she has blended her expertise in leading complex organizations with her perspective as an artist and multimedia storyteller. Her workshops and interactive talks help audiences embrace transformation by making today's leadership concepts come alive through art and storytelling. Melanie has worked with Fortune 500 organizations, rising startups, leading universities, nonprofits, and governmental groups. She speaks on a variety of topics, including leading change, organizational culture, women in leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the future of education, and the use of creativity and the arts in business. She has personally advised hundreds of university presidents and other executive leaders on a wide range of strategic and leadership matters. Her debut book, Beyond Leaning In, Gender Equity and What Organizations Are Up Against, received a silver medal in the 2022 Axiom Awards, which recognizes the world's best business books. Prior to starting Strategic Imagination, she served as the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Research at EAB Global, a Washington, D.C. education technology and consulting firm. As a founding member of the EAB leadership team, she helped grow the startup from just 30 staff members to more than 1,000 employees until it was acquired by Vista Equity Partners for more than $1 billion. Melanie led a team of more than 100 consultants that provided management advice for more than 1,500 universities worldwide. Melanie has also taught literature, visual culture, and leadership courses at UCLA while earning her Ph.D. in English. She grew up in California and now lives in Washington, D.C. All right, here's your cue. It is my pleasure to welcome Melanie Ho.
I absolutely love being on college campuses. First of all, the beauty of it, but also the energy around 2 things. One is learning, the other is unlearning, because a lot of what we do in higher education is question our assumptions. And I think one of the most beautiful commencement speeches for discussing that is David Foster Wallace's called This Is Water. If you haven't had a chance to read it or watch a video of it, I highly recommend it. In it, David Foster Wallace talks about an older fish that's swimming by 2 younger fish. And the older fish says to the 2 younger fish, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The 2 younger fish swim along for a little bit until one of them looks at the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" For David Foster Wallace, this fish story was an important way of describing how the most obvious and most important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and also hardest to talk about. For today, as we discuss some of the challenges that women leaders still face in business, we'll look at 3 questions. What is the water? How do we talk about the water? And then finally, how do we change the water? We'll begin with a little bit of my journey. I had never drawn a comic until 2020 during the pandemic, took a comics drawing class, and started drawing comics to discuss the challenges that women face in the workplace, not just because it was fun, but because I felt like it was a medium that could help us get past some of the things that make these topics so difficult to talk about. I'll show you a sampling of some of the audience favorite comics based on scenes in my book. These are the comics where I'll usually get DMs saying, you know, I really wanted to like your comic on LinkedIn or Instagram or wherever, but I couldn't because my boss and I are friends on LinkedIn and they would see it. And then finally, we'll have some time for Q&A. But to begin my story, the year was 2013, and I went from managing 4 people to 40 to 70 almost overnight. First of all, this is not a really good idea, not best practice. But somebody had left, there was a void, and I was there to fill it. It was a sudden shock for me, because not only did I suddenly see some of the challenges I was facing now as a woman in a senior position, often the only woman in the room, but also now I had all these data points. Before that, I knew my experience as a woman in the workplace. I knew the experiences of some of my closest friends. We would talk about what we were facing. Now I had this entire team. And as a senior leader, I was in meetings with other senior leaders where we discussed all of our staff. And I could see all the little ways that women and men were discussed differently across all the levels. It was shocking. Now I wondered, is this just me? Do I just work at a weird place? I started getting obsessive about it. I would talk to women everywhere. If you were sitting next to me on an airplane, if we were at a barbecue together, I would say, hey, let me bend your ear. What's going on in your workplace? And I found time and time again that everywhere, didn't matter the sector, it didn't matter if the organization was big or small, women were telling me the same stories. Now that year, 2013, was the same year that Sheryl Sandberg published her book, Lean In. At first, I was really excited. She had a TED Talk that came out a few years before that. It was about how women need to take our seats at the table, raise our hands, be more confident. I'll tell you, I watched that again and again and again. Some of my friends and I, we would watch it before we were about to ask for a promotion or a raise. It was like this rallying cry. And so when Lean In the book came out, I thought, this is fantastic. I'm seeing around me for the first time the extent of challenges that women are still facing. And now that we have this book by a Facebook executive, it sounds like everybody's talking about it. Even if they're not reading it, they're at least reading the book reviews. Maybe now we'll finally have some quote unquote real talk about what women face at work. Quickly, though, I was disappointed. Sheryl Sandberg in her book is really specific. She is not trying to solve all of gender equity. She says this is one slice of the pie. But here's the problem. Corporate America loves its sound bites. It loves its simple solutions to complex problems. And Lean In provided just that. It wasn't just, hey, give me a solution that will fit on one page or on one PowerPoint slide or even on one bullet point. It was 2 words that became this corporate mantra for any time, any kind of challenge was raised in my workplace about what women were facing. The answer was, well, let's just teach her how to lean in. Let's fix that confidence gap. Let's give the woman assertiveness training. And so everywhere, and I would talk to women across all kinds of industries, women were being told to lean in, not taking into account, I think of it as like a gigantic seatbelt, the systemic and cultural barriers that were strapping us back in our seats. This is one of the first comics that I drew to illustrate what it felt like to be in the workplace at the beginning of Lean In as this mantra everywhere. Women's leadership programs like this one became the norm. we see at the top there this welcome to women in a leadership program saying, hey, be more confident. We want you to lean in. And the women in the audience were thinking things like, well, what about the time I leaned in for 2 times the work as my male peers and maybe some less pay? We talk a lot about equal pay in the workplace, not enough, but at least that phrase is known. There's less discussion of equal penalty. In the middle there, a woman thinking, you know, there's a man on my team who's always slacking off. Is he told to lean in? And then probably the most important on the right side there, a woman thinking, well, why is the focus always on fixing women? And that was the challenge of lean in. Not that confidence trainings and assertiveness and helping women make sure we take our seats at the table, all of that is important. But all of that is about fixing the woman, not fixing the system. Why is it so hard to fix the system, though? The answer surprised me. Because the more I started digging in here, looking at the research across disciplines, interviewing women across different sectors, what I found is that so many women tried to bring up these conversations at their workplace, tried to have real talk about what's going on, and found that the emotions around these topics often get in the way. Now, we don't like to talk about emotions in the workplace. It kind of sounds fuzzy. It sounds like something that shouldn't be discussed at work. But we all have emotions. I'll often ask folks when I'm about to do a diversity, equity, and inclusion training in the workplace, hey, when you're about to attend a DEI training at work, what emotions do you feel? What emotions do you think are going around in the room? And usually people describe this combination of emotions. I think of it as like an emotion soup. Some people are excited and optimistic. They are glad that we're talking about these issues. They might be hopeful. It's time. There might be some fear. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Some anger. Hey, why are we talking about this instead of something else? Or why are we still talking about this? Why hasn't it been solved yet? Or maybe anger about something that happened the last time there was a training. There could be shame. People attending wondering if they've done enough. There could be guilt, sadness, a fear of reliving past traumas. Whatever it is, even if we are told that emotions don't belong in the workplace, we have those emotions. We come into DEI discussions with our defenses up, our guards, and our armor on. When we have those defenses, those guards up, that armor on, it makes it really hard to have that real talk. It makes it really hard to imagine new solutions. It makes it really hard to see and talk about the water. And so I started to wonder, how do we get past that emotion soup? How do we have these discussions that are only happening behind closed doors? Now, I think career journeys are fascinating. I love to hear about how people got to where they are, because usually it's a surprising path. It's one that looks more like what you see on the right there, those squiggles, than any kind of straight A to B. That was the case for me as well. I started my career studying literature and art. I wrote a dissertation called Useful Fiction for my Ph.D. It was about the novel as a type of self-help. I was fascinated by research by psychologists on how novels can build empathy, can help us get into the shoes of somebody unlike us. After getting my PhD in literature, I decided to do other things. I was interested in business. I was interested in organizational change. I thought that I had left that behind me when I went into the business world. Of course, storytelling is important, writing is important, so it's not that I didn't see that I was still bringing those liberal arts skills with me. But thinking about novels themselves, that didn't seem like it would be relevant anymore. And then I started discovering things, other business books written as novels, and this wonderful book here called Leading Transformation, which really shifted how I think. Now, it's a book published by Harvard Business Review Press. The three authors at the bottom there, two of them are folks that you would expect to write a book published by HBR Press, MBAs, business consultants. The third is a neurobiologist. And the three of them tell the story of their time at Lowe's, the hardware store. In 2012, Lowe's was running hard to stay in second place to Home Depot. They had massive closings, layoffs. And if you had asked a member of the Lowe's leadership team what was getting in their way, they would have said that they couldn't imagine a different future because they were so focused on incrementalism, what's right in front of us, instead of what's potentially bolder in terms of their strategy. Now, these are smart folks. They had all the strategy books. They had tons of data their team had done. Market research data, demographic trends, technology trends, all the things that should have helped them come up with strategies for Lowe's to be able to climb out of the hole that they were in. But what was getting in their way? Emotion soup. That was why they needed a neurobiologist, because they found that they were getting stuck. They were afraid of change, even if they didn't want to be. They were uncomfortable emotionally with the idea of doing something different, even if all the data told them otherwise. Based on the research of the neurobiologist, they ended up hiring 5 science fiction writers. And they gave those science fiction writers all of that data: market research, demographics, technology trends. Those science fiction writers came up with stories about the future of Lowe's. They gave those to a comic book artist. The comic book artist then drew a comic, you can see a little excerpt of it there, of a young family who had just bought an old home. They loved its history. They needed to renovate it, and they were having a hard time articulating their vision to their contractor. Everybody was frustrated. And so in the comic, they go to this Lowe's of the future. They put on their augmented reality glasses, and suddenly they see their home with new finishings, renovated. And of course, in the comic, they then buy all of those things from Lowe's. Now, this comic turned around Lowe's entire strategy. Within a few years, they were on the cover of Fast Company and Forbes and all of the equivalent magazines because they had done things like partnered with Google on AR glasses. They had created exoskeletons that employees could wear in order to lift heavy items. They had robots that they were testing out to greet customers. All of this was the stuff of the sci-fi that those writers, that comic book artist had imagined for them. And they had a board that before that, some of them didn't even like science fiction, were incredibly skeptical of this idea. But all the fears they had about the future, those dissipated because they got so interested in the story. Now, I was fascinated by this example. At the time, I was working with a group of college and university presidents on strategic planning and started applying it to the work I was doing with them. My team created fake marketing brochures about fake future universities. Here's what higher ed could look like in, say, 2050. The presidents loved that. They were excited. But one of them came to me and said, I want my board to draw also. And I had met her board. And I thought, is this a good idea? I can't imagine them with crayons. She was insistent, though, and the customer's always right. So came in, had her board start drawing, and saw the difference. I ended up starting my own firm shortly after that because I was so excited to see the power of fiction, the power of art for things like business strategy. bringing myself back to my passions for my PhD program. But I was especially excited to think, okay, if these tools can help us when we're afraid of future strategies, can they also help us for topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion, where that same emotion soup is keeping us from having the conversations we need to have? I've been gathering research for years by this point. Ended up writing my book, Beyond Leaning In. It's a business book written as a novel. We go through a fictional company, the point of view of characters, men and women across different generations, across different levels of the organizational charts. There are no villains in this book. They are all people trying to do the right thing, but unintentionally getting in their own way. My hope with the book, and then the comics I started drawing based on it, is that we could unlock the power of the arts to do things like lower our guards and make sense of our experiences, develop empathy for others, but also maybe activate our imaginations in a new way. You can find over 50 comics on my website. They're all downloadable. They're in a Dropbox folder. I want people to use them. No permission needed. If they're helpful for conversations that you're having with friends or family members or colleagues, please make use of any of the comics. But I'll just show you now some of the top 5. This one is called The Cupcake Trap, and probably the comic I talk about the most. As I was interviewing women, so many women said to me, you know, I love to bake, but I don't want to be seen as the baker in the office. Or there's a young woman who's working for me right now, and she's bringing cupcakes a lot, and I'm worried that she's being seen as the baker instead of for her other skills. But I don't necessarily want to tell her to not bake. Am I a bad feminist if I tell her not to bake? On the left here, inspired by those conversations, I've pictured a promotion memo. It congratulates Mike and Mara for their promotions to the exact same position, analytics manager. Mike led the analysis for a critical project that led to $5 million in revenues. Mara has a fantastic work ethic and great baking skills. All of us have gained a few pounds from her cupcakes. Now, I pictured this as a promotion memo, but it could be a conversation people have in the hallway about Mike and Mara. It could be how they're introduced to a new coworker. It could be how they're introduced to a client or at a conference. And I wrote this one about baking, but many of the stories I heard from women weren't just about baking. They might have been things like Mike brought in $5 million in revenues and Mara is the glue of the office. Mara always looks so put together. She's the first person to volunteer to help a colleague out. What inspired me here, besides all the conversations about baking, was research on letters of recommendation written for undergraduates applying to medical school. And the research shows that for men undergraduates, letters are more likely to use superlatives, top 1%, top 3%, to use words that indicate exceptional talent, their intelligence, things like that. The letters of recommendation for women undergraduates with equivalent academic records and achievements were more likely to use words not about their ability, but about how hard they worked, their dedication, their effort, and less likely to use any of those superlative words, the 1%, 3%. I was so fascinated by this. I started finding all of the research I could uncover that talked about this not just in terms of letters of recommendation, but into the workplace. And so we keep seeing examples like what we see in this memo here, where perhaps Mara brought in $10 million in revenues. But what she is recognized for isn't those concrete accomplishments, the ones that got her promoted, but instead, the ones that got her promoted, 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 the but these other softer attributes, quote unquote softer. Now at the bottom there, I drew a guy who's saying, what's the big deal? They both got promoted. I drew it as a guy, but it doesn't have to be. It could have been me. I have certainly looked back and thought about the times that I've been so influenced by the water, that I've introduced a woman colleague talking about her personality instead of her concrete accomplishments. I've also been the person who's noticed it, saw that memo, stormed into the office of the person who wrote it and said, hey, Mara brought in 10 million in revenues. Why aren't we taking that into account? And then I've also been the person who's seen this memo, kind of shook my head or rolled my eyes, this again, and then didn't do anything because I felt like, how many of these can I complain about in a single week? What's the big deal? They both got promoted. We use the phrase microaggressions to talk about things like this. The double standards, the biases that go unchecked, that happen every single day. I think sometimes there can be a challenge with that phrase microaggressions because the word micro, okay, if it's micro, what does it matter? They both got promoted. Now at the top right, we start to see why it does matter. These two colleagues I've drawn in the top right there, they don't harbor any specific bias against Mara or for Mike. They've never met them. This could be 3 weeks later. This could be 6 months or 2 years later. And one of them says, I'm looking for project help. What do you know about Mike or Mara? His colleague says, I heard Mike is great. I don't know much about Mara. They don't know them. But people remember Mike for the revenues and Mara for the cupcakes. And that's the water. There's nobody ill-intended here. Whoever wrote the memo, whoever sent the memo, these two individuals later on. But these small things can have ripple effects. Now, I first started drawing comics in 2021. It was the middle of the pandemic. And when I started speaking about the comics, it was largely on Zoom. And so it wasn't until the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, where I started to do these talks in person. When I began doing them in person, I actually could hear more of the objections. Often I would hear objections from leaders who would say, well, this happens at other places, places where people aren't as aware. This doesn't happen here. Because if it happened here, I would know about it. And I'll say I often knew a lot of the employees at those places, so I knew it happened there. Now, these leaders thought that if it happened there, someone would tell them. That's why I ended up drawing this next comic, to discuss, well, why is it so hard for Mara to speak up? Why is it hard for anyone who experiences workplace bias to speak up? Well, Mara knows, but because of the water, the various ways that women can be treated or viewed, if she speaks up, if she says, why weren't my revenues taken into account in that memo, the perception might be she's very difficult, so much drama. Now let's take into account intersectionality. The intersection of gender with, say, race. And when it comes to intersectionality, what's really important is that it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's that the ultimate impact, the whole, is greater than the sum of its parts, so that if Mara is a Black woman and she raises these issues, the response, because of the biases that she faces based on both gender and race, might be she needs to be less angry and aggressive. If Mara is an Asian woman, she is subject to a bias and expectation that she be submissive and meek. Well, she must just have not gotten the joke here. And if Mara is any set of identity categories that are typically underrepresented, underestimated, marginalized, their perception might be she should just feel lucky to work here. A lot of the water, a lot of these biases that make it so hard for women to figure out the exact tightrope to walk in the workplace come down to what researchers call the Goldilocks dilemma. At the top there, she comes off a little strong. She needs to soften, let her hair frame her face. This is advice that so many women who were seen as too stereotypically masculine in some way have told me they've received from mentors. On the flip side, a lot of women have said that they've received the advice at the bottom there. She seems too meek. She needs to learn to power pose and not wear pastels. And I'll confess, I drew this comic as about being about appearance because that was a little bit easier to draw. But the Goldilocks dilemma isn't just about appearance. It's about how women are perceived and judged in actions, in tone, and more. That we walk this kind of tightrope. Now, men walk this tightrope too. Everyone's got to have a style that balances a certain amount of, say, assertiveness and communal behavior. But the tightrope is smaller for women. And because of that, what women told me time and again was that they felt almost like they had to wrap their comments in bubble wrap. The fear of, if you lean in, if you raise your hand, if you are confident, of then being seen as bitchy, as being too aggressive for something that a man would be seen as assertive. And that mental chatter, that calculation, going about the workday was exhausting, especially as women got more senior. Now, I'm often asked, well, things are going to be better, right? Things are going to be better because generationally we see these shifts. I do think that things are better in many ways, but the challenge is the water is so strong, the double standards run so deep. This is about a recent incident a friend told me she watched at the playground. I drew this comic because so many audiences I would talk to, and someone would raise their hand at the end and say, well, things are getting better because the newer generations coming into the workplace will change everything. And while I think some of that is true, not all of it is true. My friend was at the playground. She was there with her toddler. He wasn't in the tennis class, but she was watching this tennis class going on. And at the end of the tennis class, the teacher said, if you clean up the balls, you'll get a snack. She told me she watched in horror at what happened. That all the girls cleaned up, the boys goofed off with the teacher. Not their fault, the teacher let them, was goofing off with them. And that what she said appalled her the most about it was that the parents laughed. Girls are so organized, boys will be boys, and then everyone got that same snack. A few years ago, there was a TikTok that went viral about this phrase, weaponized incompetence. It's a very strong, controversial phrase. But it got to this idea that boys will be boys. Oh, they're not good at cleaning up, so we won't make them. We'll just have the girls clean up. My friend said what was really surprising to her, we live in Washington, D.C. You can bet that every single one of those millennial parents with Gen Z or Gen Alpha kids have been to many, many unconscious bias trainings in their workplace. Most of them probably have marched for women many times. You can bet they're all posting on Instagram stories with memes about equality in the workplace and equality at home, in who does what. And yet this is how strong that water is, how deep our biases are, that without thinking, we just laugh. Girls are so organized, boys will be boys, everyone gets the snack. Now what happens when these kids grow up into the workplace. I recently did a panel with a group of 5 women university presidents and had them go through some of my comics and vote on the one that they wished everyone would see to understand what is their experience still as a woman CEO, essentially, of multi-billion-dollar institutions. What do they still face? And to me, this is just an extension of what we see on the playground. That we can take these 2 leaders, Jen and Tim, and for them, the same closed door comes with different expectations. This could be leaders. This could also be professors. The left side, Jen's door is closed. What's the perception? What does the research show as far as the biases that we have? The perceptions by those across genders. This isn't about men versus women. This is about the water that we all swim in, where we have these expectations. We expect Jen to be accessible. So when her door is closed, the perception is she's so inaccessible. She must think she's so important. Who does she think she is? Now, on the right side with Tim, he's really busy and important, so of course his door is never open. Let's look below that. Let's say Jen opens her door for 5 minutes, or while she's running from one meeting to another meeting, she stops in the hallway and talks to someone, even though she could use those 5 minutes to get a snack. She was only able to help me for 5 minutes. She must be in over her head with this job. Tim, he was so generous to help me for 5 minutes when he's got so much to do. Often the word privilege feels very loaded. Talk about emotion soup. When we say the word privilege, when we talk about privilege, there's all kinds of emotions that come up: anger, sadness, shame, guilt, fear, fury, whatever. Because sometimes it seems like privilege is about something personal. It's not. Privilege is the water. Privilege is the water by which, when Tim's door is closed, the perspective on that by folks across genders is different from the perspective of Jen's door being closed. That privilege means that Tim doesn't have to even think about the fact that his door is closed. He can just close it when he needs to. Jen is going about the day wondering about whether or not she needs to open her door, what she should do about the fact that she needs to close her door. I remember in my corporate job, sometimes women who just entered management positions would say to me, well, how do you protect your time and still look accessible? And I had all these tricks. I had a candy bowl that I kept in my office because the candy bowl exudes warmth and openness and accessibility. And so I felt like, okay, if I close my door at some times, at least the candy bowl will counterbalance the negative perceptions. And it was so interesting later on as I started to talk to a lot of women in similar positions. They all had these little tricks. Privilege is not having to think about those tricks. What all of this leads to is a situation where if we think back about David Foster Wallace's metaphor and our water, that our workplaces, some of us can be in that water and not even notice it. Whereas for others, the water might feel freezing or might feel boiling. Now, what I'm excited about is that we can change the water, and that just like the Lowe's folks used comics and science fiction to get out from the place where they were doing the layoffs and the closings and trying to stay current compared to Home Depot, I've had the privilege of spending time with so many different workplaces where we not just look at comics as a way to talk about hard things, but also draw comics. And these are just a few examples of some of the comics that I've seen really serious leaders who you wouldn't think would want a marker, but once they've got a marker in their hand, they draw these beautiful comics to reflect on, okay, Mara in our first comic with the cupcake trap, what's that bias feel like her? They get into her shoes. They also draw solutions, the things they want their workplace to look like. And so it's very exciting to me how art can help us talk about these things and can also help us imagine new futures. I'm excited to hear your questions. I will pose a few reflection questions for all of you to think about across the coming week. What does the water look and feel like for you in groups that you're in, classrooms you're in, internships you're in? What's the water look and feel like for those around you, maybe those unlike you? Can you learn about their water? And what conversations do you want to have about the water with others in your life? You can also text VOICE to 6686. I won't text you, it's just to gather your email addresses if you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter for these and more comics, updates on my upcoming graphic novel, and to subscribe to my newsletter. So thank you, and I'm excited for your questions.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker again for that wonderful, powerful message that she shared with us. So we're transitioning now to the Q&A portion. So you see we've got a couple of microphones set up. So we're just going to invite folks to come down that you can ask questions to Melanie. You can just form a single file line on either side and just hang out, wait in line. We'll call on the microphones, and then people who are brave enough to ask a question, I know you have some, you will get a book. And I will say, I read this book last spring, and it is fantastic because it's a story. So if you didn't get that part, this is a fictional story, and it's wonderful. All right, so why don't we start over here?
Hi, okay. I was just wondering which character you relate to most in your novel and why?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. You know, I think as an author, I end up putting myself in all of the characters, so I always find that question really difficult. But for those of you who haven't read it, we go through a lot of different characters. There's a CEO, Deborah. She's a baby boomer. I'm not a baby boomer, but in many ways, I put a little bit of myself in her as somebody who's feeling the pressure of being in a senior position and trying to figure out how to solve things. There's a character named Cassandra who is probably most like me in a way. She's the millennial reverse mentor that kind of helps Deborah see what she was missing. And in a lot of ways, she was my voice of the things I wanted other people to see. There's a character named Amber who goes through the shock of being denied a promotion that she had been promised, and I had been in a position like that as well, so a little bit of me in her as well.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, it wasn't talked about a lot, but I feel like normally the biggest inequality you hear is the wage gap. Mentioned in one of our previous lectures, it said men are 80% more likely to ask for a higher wage. What impact do you think that has on the wage gap?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you may have seen the more recent research. There's so many different studies pointing out different versions of that. So I think there was one recently saying that that actually isn't as true as people think they do. There are other studies that show that when women ask for any kind of raise or anything financial on behalf of themselves, they're more likely to get shot down because of that perception that women aren't supposed to be kind of going after money. And so women are more likely to get something if they advocate on behalf of another woman to get that money. And so I think it's complicated because of that. It's a good question, though.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you for lecturing today. My question is, so right now, with using creative solutions to bring awareness to women's issues in the workplace, what's the next step to get us closer to equality?
Oh gosh, so many different next steps. I think the first next step is that everybody needs to be able to take a pause a little bit. And I'd say that what I see in corporate America is that the desire for solutions that can be implemented as fast as possible tend to be what prevent long-term gain. And so that's why we move so slowly. I'll give you one example. This is actually a higher education example, and not related to gender specifically, but the one that came to my mind is I spent some time working with college and university chief development officers who wanted to diversify their fundraising ranks, and most fundraisers are white. And so they were looking, well, how do we have more diverse fundraisers in higher education where our alumni base may be more racially diverse, and we want to make sure that our development staff match that. And if you look to the existing pipeline, that won't work. You have to recruit from new sources. So you could say someone who's really good at sales is probably going to be really good at fundraising. And sales teams are usually more racially diverse. And so really all college and university development leaders need to do is look to, say, sales teams to be able to bring in more diversity into their fundraising staff. Some of them actually do that and have found great results, not just in terms of having more diverse fundraising staff, but also in bringing in new skill sets that are useful for them. But doing that takes more time. They have to recruit from a broader set than they usually do. They have to onboard those sales staff into the fundraising role. It might take 3 months to teach them that new job instead of 1 month. And so that 2 months will sometimes keep those leaders from hiring the people that otherwise they would want to hire. They'll say, oh yeah, those sales staff, actually, I think they're going to be even better at that job in a year than the other people we were thinking about hiring, but it would take 2 more months to bring them in. And so usually with any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, what I find is that this fear of taking a few more months, a few more weeks up front keeps employers from doing the right thing long term.
Thank you.
You talked about your candy bowl to kind of increase how welcoming your workspace was, and that there were some more tips or other examples that you had. What were some of those examples, and how effective they were in making their workplace feel more welcoming to their employees?
Yeah, so I mean, the candy bowl was probably my sort of silly example of doing it. I talked to a lot of leaders about psychological safety generally, and that not as the candy bowl was a kind of a tactic to make up for something, but just overall creating psychologically safe spaces by doing things like normalizing trial and error, normalizing that, especially during times of change, sometimes things go wrong. I think people are more likely to be their whole selves at work and be more open when they know that it's okay to fail. I recommend usually that leaders normalize emotions as part of the workplace, that when there's something big going on, there's a big change, hey, we're all gonna feel a little sad about it because we're sad about what used to be, or we might feel angry because the new change requires us to, work harder, learn something new. And that teams that have that kind of just more open and authentic way of relating to each other are more effective in terms of productivity, but that it's also a more welcoming culture.
Thank you.
So we have time for a few more questions. Let's head back over here.
Hi, Melanie. I was just wondering, so earlier you talked about your tennis club sort of example about systemic biases and things like that. How do you navigate approaching those sort of conversations about those systemic issues outside of your workplace?
Like at home,
Yeah.
you mean? Yeah, there are some great resources for doing that at home. So one that I recommend, I don't use personally, but I know some of my friends use the resources called Fair Play. There's even a playing card deck. And it's designed for couples to be able to talk about just, not just how are they delegating and splitting up tasks at home, but who's also doing the mental load. The phrase mental load has been a really helpful one that's come into the popular vernacular now. That let's say even if there are two parents and they divide the pickup of the kids from school equally. Each of them picks up the kids the same number of days. Often there's one parent who is carrying more of the mental load of keeping track of the schedule, the person that the teachers contact, creating the packing list for vacations, even if they split up the packing list. And so even if the executing is split up, there's often one parent that's doing the managing of those tasks more. And it doesn't have to be just related to kids, but just generally. And so conversations at home, I think about, okay, not just who does what, but who notices what. For kids, there's, I can't remember the name of it, there's an Instagram account that goes through just even with kids, teaching all the kids how to notice what's going on in the running of a household. That, hey, there's a mess. Don't wait for somebody to tell you to clean up. Just notice all the things that have to get done. And so in that example of the tennis class, I'm guessing, wasn't there, I'm guessing that probably those girls in the tennis class at home, they're probably expected to maybe clean up after themselves. And their brothers, in some of those cases, might not have been raised with the same expectations.
Thank you.
Great. And I think, sadly, this is our last question.
Do you think that discrimination can vary from like workplace to workplace? Like, for example, nursing, since that is more of a occupation for females, that if a male goes into nursing, they could experience some forms of microaggression?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so, I think that in professions that are more women-dominated, that men in them definitely face societal expectations of sort of treating them differently, judging them. I also find that women in those professions end up feeling like they face the challenge of being underestimated differently than the challenge of being underrepresented. And so for nursing is an interesting one because the person who's I'm drawing a blank on the name, but the person who's in charge of all the nurses, the chief nursing officer, that person's basically running the hospital. I mean, they're the one that knows everything that's going on. The chief nursing officer is never going to become the CEO of the hospital. The CEO of the hospital is probably going to come from, the head of surgery. Even though if you think about what it takes to be the CEO, the operational management of all of that, the keeping track of all the parts, the understanding everything that goes on in the hospital, the chief nursing officer is probably the best prepared in so many different ways. But because that is seen as a feminine profession, that person will unlikely become the CEO.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you all. Thanks all for being here. We want to say a special thank you to our speaker, but also a thank you to the McGregor family, whose generosity allows us to offer this lecture every year. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for your commitment to gender equality, and I hope you all have a great night.